cultural evolution. Kind of an interesting chapter. I really enjoyed this one because having moved around the world as much as I have, I've seen this over and over again. Places like Japan's totally different than Germany. Um, Places in the United States. California's not the same as Mississippi. Mississippi's not the same as Indiana. And even two farming areas like Iowa and Indiana are not at all the same. The fields in Iowa are huge, are just massive. 600,000 acre fields. And in Indiana, they're all chopped up into smaller fields like 40 and 60 and 100 acres and with forest in between. And in Iowa, it was plains, so totally different situation. So let's go ahead and get started. Different environments affect the ways that people go about living their lives, and we're going to talk about this a lot. And if you think about it, you guys live in the desert, and I live in an area that grows a lot of corn, corn and soybeans. And by golly, it's harvest season. I live on an orchard, as I showed you at the beginning of the semester. So yeah, my environment's very, very much different than yours. I just harvested apples. We have about, I've got to process all those apples too. We got about 10 bushels of apples that we're going to turn into cider. Of course, we eat them. Maybe by the time we turn them into cider, we'll have eaten most of them. Different environments affect the ways that people go about living their lives. Some of the ways that physical environments affect culture are quite direct. For example, if there are any large animals, there are around here. There's deer. There are deer where you are. There were buffalo, evidently, because you've got Buffalo Pass between Salie and Shiprock. Um, but sometimes there are no large indigenous animals, like on Hawaii. There are actually none. You would have to go out into the ocean to find whales, of course. But most of the animals around Hawaii are relatively small. The fish, geese, for example, small monk seals. The Hawaiians do not have any hunting traditions because they didn't need to. There were fish in the lagoon. There were geese if they wanted red meat. Um, there were seals if they wanted red meat. They didn't really have to go out and hunt humpback whales if they didn't want to. Uh, and this fish is kind of interesting. This is a Hamahama Nuka Nuka Apawa'a. It's the state fish of Hawaii. It's about a foot long, and it's colored the way that you see it right there. Very colorful fish. It's also known as the lagoon triggerfish. The Kung of the Kalahari Desert in an environment surrounded by large animals and derive much of their caloric intake by hunting them. Antelope of every shape and size, elephants if they so desire, but of course they don't. Rhinoceros and the Kalahari as well, and they probably try to stay away from those guys. But a lot of animals to hunt. Kudu, just got all the antelope that you can imagine. Gazelles. The Kung have a strong hunting tradition, of course, because red meat is their main staple. The kinds of foods that are available within a given ecology affect the kinds of foraging behaviors that people engage in. And of course, I was talking about my orchard. Of course, apples you have to are very special trees. They don't just grow anywhere. Well, they can, I guess, if you plant the seeds. But a lot of times, the apples that you get from those types of trees not very good. So most of the apples that you see in the yeah, these are apples. Those are probably crab apples. The only apple that was native to the United States were crab apples, not any other domesticated apples like the Red Delicious or the Honeycrisp or whatever you Granny Smith, whatever you like. They're pretty small apples, and of course this is a squirrel. Where I come from, of course, Indiana is mostly oak forest. It was a swamp until the farmers drained the swamps and made it into farmland. So there's a lot of forest in between the fields. Um, and there's a lot of squirrels in the forest, of course. Black squirrels, gray squirrels, fox squirrels. This is a fox squirrel. Not a very good example of one. And when I was growing, I had a lot of rabbits too, because there's a lot of habitat for them. And when I was growing up, a lot of people would hunt rabbits and squirrels because they were so numerous and they were so easy to shoot. They usually used a 410 shotgun, if you know what a 410 is. Anyway, probably not a 22. It's too easy. You don't always kill them with a 22. You just make a hole in them. According to Gilmore, and those cultures where the environment is harsh and requires courage and physical prowess to secure a living, cultures of masculinity that value the strength and the toughness of males are more likely to emerge. Big game, where there's large game is hunted, is another place where this macho concept of masculinity would be. Places where risky deep sea fishing is performed. On the South Pacific island of Truk, men traditionally had to go on dangerous deep sea fishing expeditions to secure food for their families. The Truckees greatly value masculinity, which is manifested by young men engaging in frequent violent drunken melees with knives and clubs. They fight each other and to show each other how strong they are. The better hunter you are, the more food that you can accumulate, and this is something that they would want to demonstrate to all. And of course, if you can secure enough food, then of course you get reproductive. You're more likely to find someone that wants to mate with you. They tend to be male-dominated societies with a lot of violence. Culture where the environment is more benign and food is plentiful and more easily acquired, more androgynous gender roles are more likely to emerge. Men in Tahiti do not need to hunt and fish because fish are readily available in the shallow lagoons, and they really don't have to compete. And since they don't have to compete for the food, they don't, and they're much less violent. There is virtually no warfare and feuding on Tahiti, and there is little evidence that masculinity is a matter of much concern with the Tahitians. The harsher the environment and the scarcer the resources, the more manhood is stressed. Environment shapes lifestyle, if you can imagine that. A place where it wasn't important to be the biggest and the strongest and the meanest, especially the meanest. And so, because food was plentiful on Tahiti, and in many of the South Pacific islands, it's the same way. There's food aplenty, and of course, you don't have to compete for it. And since you don't have to compete, you don't have to be the biggest and strongest, as I said before. 1532, Juan Pizarro and 168 soldiers met with the Incan Emperor Atahualpa and captured the emperor and killed 7,000 Incan warriors, 168 versus tens of thousands. Within a year, the Spaniards won battle after battle against impossible odds and conquered the Incan Empire. So how in the world did this happen? Why did it happen? How did it happen? Proximal means direct and immediate. Proximal cause of the Spanish success would be the Spanish political organization drew on thousands of years of written history, ocean-going ships to get from Europe to the New World, steel swords and armor, horses, smallpox, which decimated the Incans. As weird as that may seem, smallpox was probably the most important of all of these things. Because smallpox, because what How smallpox works, smallpox is a virus. And Europeans, because they live with their livestock, would pass the diseases back and forth between the livestock and the humans, and it would become more and more virulent every time it's being passed back and forth. Maybe for 100 years, there's no problem. It's the same thing that happened with COVID. COVID was I had seen COVID before, not COVID, but the coronavirus before, back in the 1980s, and it was causing a problem called walking pneumonia. We saw it in Europe in the early 1980s. We saw it, and it didn't kill anybody. I don't think it killed anybody. I don't remember anybody dying. Anyway, we had this outbreak of walking pneumonia, and people caught it, but nobody died that I can remember. This was when I was in the military, and it was the coronavirus. But the next time we saw it, the next time it reappeared, it came out of Asia, came out of China, and at this point it was far more virulent than it was back in the 1980s when we saw it when I saw it for the first time. And this is the way it works. You pass it back and forth with your livestock. And in that case, it was they thought that it came out of pangolins at a wet market where they had wild animals that people ate, and they think that's where it came from. And that's one of the reasons, anyway. Distal means proximal means close, close in, direct, immediate. The written history, the ocean-going ships, steel armor, and swords, horses, and of course all the diseases that were being passed back and forth. The other thing that they rarely talk about, sure, there were 168 soldiers, but they also had allies that wanted to see the Incans overthrown, and that was the main part of their army was not Spaniards, but their indigenous allies. Distal means long-term and indirect. The Spaniards came from a history of environments with food sources that supported large populations. The Fertile Crescent in the Middle East, where wheat, barley, peas, and lentils grew. They domesticated a lot of animals. The sheep, goats, pigs, donkeys, and cows came out of the Old World. Such strong agricultural endeavors enabled the formerly nomadic people to adopt more sedentary lifestyles, which in turn allowed them to seek scientific improvements. And of course, we were seeing the same things in the New World, in the Americas, with corn, with potatoes. What else did they have that they were eating? Chilies, tomatoes. They had all of these foods. They didn't have as many domesticated animals. About the only thing that they domesticated guinea pigs in South America. They also domesticated turkeys in North America. So that was the fowl. That was the animals that they had available to them for food. They had wild animals, buffaloes, elk, and deer. Of course, they have those in the Old World as well, but no one has been able to domesticate any of those animals. But there you go. The domestication of various animals allows the people in the Eurasian area to live in a close proximity with animals for thousands of years. Because of this proximity, as I described before, diseases developed and were traded back and forth between the Eurasians and the animals, so that animal diseases now affected humans. Measles, tuberculosis, smallpox, influenza, all of these are viruses. No, tuberculosis is measles is a virus, smallpox and influenza are viruses. Tuberculosis is a bacteria. For thousands of years, diseases swept through the cities and towns of Eurasia, killing off millions, but leaving populations of people immune to these scourges. When these diseases were introduced to the uninitiated populations in the Americas, the lack of immunity wiped out whole nations. It is said that the White Clay people, also known as the A'aninin, also known as the Grovon, people of Montana, talk of their 600 lodges that they had. They were a huge tribe, and it was reduced down to 60 when smallpox first struck the tribe in the 1860s, 1870s. They were one of the more powerful tribes, them, the Blackfeet. They were able to keep the other tribes away from them, to make them enemies, to hunt buffalo. They were buffalo hunters. And then, of course, they went from 600 to 60 lodges. And there were anywhere between 10 and 20 people in each lodge. So it was a large tribe. Burial had to take place in trees because so many people died at once. They normally took their dead into the mountains and buried them in rock crevices. Similar to, I was reading, what was it, Laughing Boy. He placed his dead wife in in a crevice along with a horse, and they did the same thing. China is a large country in Eastern Asia, and this is what China looks like. The orange and the green and the yellow, that is China. In the north, the people eat and grow wheat because it's colder, and in the south, where it's more humid and more, there's a lot more water, they grow rice and eat rice. Because there's a vast difference between growing rice and wheat, the two areas have developed different social structures. Really kind of fascinating. Now, the vast majority of people in China live in the south, but there are people that live in the north. Beijing is right here. That's where Beijing is, on these rivers right here. And in the north, they grow wheat, and they eat a lot of wheat. And because they're wheat farmers, they act differently than the rice farmers in the south. It gets really fascinating. Rice is cultivated in paddies, plots of standing water, and this is what it looks like. This is a terraced fields of terraced rice. There has to be sufficient rainfall where it is channeled through irrigation channels. This requires a great deal of coordination and cooperation between farmers. Rice farming is labor intensive, often requiring work by whole families. Wheat farming is done in fields that rarely require irrigation. The wheat farmer does have to cooperate with his neighbor, does not have to cooperate with his neighbors. He just broadcasts the wheat out there. He doesn't have to put it in rows. He can do it any way that he wants. Wheat farming is far less labor intensive because all you have to do is throw it out there, let it grow, and then in the late summer, early fall, you harvest it and get all your grain. And that's all there is to it. Lots of labor. Families have to work in rice fields and rice paddies, but wheat farmers, they're fairly individualistic. Looking at people from northern and southern China, researchers discovered that rice growers from the south showed more interdependent thinking styles. They saw themselves as part of a network. They were tolerant of nepotism. They engaged in more holistic reasoning. And this is a video. It's kind of a funny video, and it shows you the difference between northern people and southern people in China. As they get a little risque here, just a little bit. It's not too bad. Wait a second. Maybe. Okay. Chinese girlfriends.
美女，能给我你的电话号码吗？
She's from the south.
美女，能给我你的电话号码吗？
喝呀喝呀喝呀！
The lady from the north.
Come on, pussy!
lady from the south.
亲爱的，要不要来一点？
可是我喝一点点就会很晕嘞。
就来一点点啦。啊！
Lady from the north. Look at all the food.
这是我特意为你做的。
哇塞，你好厉害呀，亲爱的！
哎，怎样？怎样？哎，What's your problem？
别打了！
哎！我要抱歉，哎，你What's your problem？ 哎，你开始。
好恐怖，我不敢看。
亲爱的，能不能先不要看了这个？
这有什么好怕？抢我包！好讨厌！哇塞，你看这个男的长得很帅，有没有？
最爱你的人是我，你怎么舍得我？许多故事有伤心的理由，这一次我的爱情。
Come on, pussy!
One more time，今天要被他打死。
I think that's just funny. Anyway, the difference between people from the north and people from the south. There we go. Wait a second. Where am I going? Where am I? There we go. Okay. Ooh, fire coming out of that lady's eyes. This is a lady from the south. This is a lady from the north. Oops. Evoked culture is the idea that people, no matter where they are have certain biologically encoded behavior patterns that can be evoked when a certain circumstance arises. When threatened, the capacity to act in an intimidating manner is universally present, especially when loved ones are threatened. Another example of evoked culture is attractiveness in a mate. People around the world prefer mates who are physically attractive. Attractive people are less likely to have parasites. Attractive people are healthier. Thus, humans have inherited preferences for attractive mates. When there is little threat from parasites or an unhealthy environment, other criteria can be used to select a mate, such as intelligence, kindness, or sense of humor. In areas that are unhealthy, attractiveness is of prime importance, as you can imagine. When people learn cultural practices by social learning or by modeling others, it is known as transmitted culture. If you watch your neighbor growing tomatoes in a hanging pot, you have learned such planting practices by observation. Despite the fact that the Dinka and the Nuer have lived beside each other for hundreds of years and they are both nomadic cattle herders and eat the same foodstuffs and descended from the same ancestors 1,000 years ago, their cultures are very different. This guy is a Dinka and this guy is a Nuer. The Nuer raise large herds of cattle and live off the milk. The Dinka butcher their herds and rely on the meat. The Dinka maintain a tribal relationship with the families they live near. The Nuer maintain kinship based on the male line. The Nuer are a larger and more militaristic tribe. The Nuer maintain costly and flexible dowry payments for their daughters, while the Dinka have small, flexible payments. Biological evolution occurs when certain genes become more common in a population than they were in the past. Biological evolution operates through natural selection. Natural selection is the evolutionary process that occurs under these conditions. Individual variability exists among members of a species on certain traits. The traits are associated with different reproductive rates. The traits have a hereditary basis. Fast-running antelope have an advantage in outrunning their predators. The trade-off would be that their increased muscle mass would require increased food to maintain them. Slow-running antelope may be more susceptible to predators, but in a time of drought, when the food sources are limited, they're more likely to survive than the fast-running antelope. Cultural evolution is where ideas are carried forward from generation to generation. Cultural evolution follows natural selection, as some ideas are more selectable in a culture than others, such as religions and political structures. Copying errors are very common with cultural ideas. Copying errors, mutations, are rare among genes. And these are the swimming outfits for women. This is what they looked like in 1875, 1890, 1900, 1925, and 1927. Of course, this lady would never be caught dead in this outfit, and this lady would never be caught dead in this outfit. So you can see how the bathing suit evolved through the ages. And of course, now we have bikinis, and I'm not going to show you that one. Anyway, genes pass slowly. Genes pass vertically from parent to offspring. Culture passes horizontally from one person to anyone they come in contact with. Cultural evolution can be very rapid. So while cultural evolution is very rapid, genetic evolution is very slow. While genes have to be adaptive to be repeated, cultural ideas do not have to be adaptive. Even maladaptive ideas can spread, as with the headhunters of New Guinea, when half of them died due to a degenerative disease passed from diseased victims, and that disease was Jacob's Creutzfeldt disease, which is very similar to mad cow's disease. It's a mutated protein that gets into your brain and creates areas that are non-functional. It makes your brain look like Swiss cheese, and because of that, a lot of the headhunters who ate people's brains, they developed this Jacob Creutzfeldt disease, and they died. And half of the people on New Guinea died because they were eating people's brains. Dynamic social impact theory posits that individuals come to influence each other, and they do so primarily in terms of how often the individuals interact, which ultimately leads to clusters of like-minded people who are separated by geography, cultures, in other words. They trade ideas back and forth. Norms develop among those who communicate with each other regularly. And I can't remember, this was a movie where Zac Efron, who is actually bigger than this now, was inducing sorority members to come and to this house. I can't remember what's going on in this movie. It was an interesting movie, though, and it had a lot to do with culture. And of course, he was an old fraternity boy, and because of that, Delta something. You can see his arm. Anyway, Delta Psi something. Interesting movie. In 2007, Callum and Harton followed a group of students for a year. The researchers set a baseline by discovering the students' attitudes before they became students, when they were right out of high school and before they became freshmen in colleges. The researchers discovered that the students that lived in the same dorms and ate in the same dining halls maintained similar attitudes no matter what attitudes they had before coming to school. The students began building microcultures within their living units. Cultures emerge when people communicate. This is really kind of interesting because this is exactly what happened on my campus. I went to a school that had about 75% of the campus were in fraternities, about 25% were in the dormitories. I was in the dormitory. I didn't want to join a fraternity. And at that time, the fraternities were segregated, which meant that they wouldn't allow African Americans to be in their fraternity. And because of that, all the African Americans lived in the dormitories. And because all the African Americans lived in the dormitories, that became our microculture. Uh, of course, the vast majority of only 13% of the population is African American, but we had 100% of all the African Americans. So because of that, the civil rights movement, which was going on at the time, became really important to the people in the dormitories. Fraternities, it just went right over their heads. They didn't have a clue what was going on, and it was really kind of interesting because this is starting in 1967. The civil rights movement was going strong. The anti-war movement was big on campuses around the United States, and all of that came out of the independent dorms, the independents. So that was my culture. That was my microculture. Now the fraternity guys, they missed it. They missed the whole thing. So when you talk to people that went to college at the same time I did, the ones that were in the dormitories became civil rights activists and anti-war activists. And the individuals that were in the fraternities had a totally different mindset, as bizarre as that seems. Okay, so we're talking about legends. Contemporary legends are simply fictional stories that are told in modern societies as if they were true. Booby-trapped Halloween candy is one such contemporary legend. There have only been 80 documented cases of these booby-trapped Halloween candy since 1959. Only 80 of them. Colonies of released alligators live in the sewers of New York City. New York is too cold for alligators to survive in the winter. The sewers are full of toxic waste that would not support reptilian life. Therefore, this whole idea of alligators living in the sewers is impossible. HIV-infected needles are being left in coin slots, return slots, to contaminate an unsuspecting person. There has never been a recorded case of anyone contracting HIV from being stuck by a needle in a coin return slot. Of course, the number of payphones in the world has gone way, way down. So this is not something we need to worry about anymore. Researchers have found that rumors and legends are more likely to spread when they can evoke shared emotional reactions among people. The characters from fiction that are the most memorable are the ones that evoke emotion in us, like Robin Hood, stole from the rich and gave to the poor. That's a pretty cool thing to do. Emotional ideas are more likely to spread through a culture than are unemotional ones. This is why our news is full of sensational stories of rescues, disasters, and wrecks, rather than the mundane things that happen every day. And this, of course, is a picture of before the earthquake and after an earthquake. This is in Italy. As you can see, most of the buildings collapsed on both sides of the street. The only thing that didn't collapse is the church tower. The Fulani of Africa believe that the world was created from a drop of milk. Japanese mythology states that the world was created from brine dripping from the tip of the jewel spear of heaven. And there's the jewel spear of heaven. Judeo-Christian beliefs state that God created the heavens and earth in 6 days, and on the seventh day he rested. The kinds of stories that are especially likely to persist in our memories are ones that contain a few minimal counterintuitive ideas. Minimally counterintuitive means that they are statements that are surprising and unusual in the sense that they violate our expectations but are not too outlandish, like this boat made out that looks like a guitar. That's pretty outlandish. Most boats don't look like that. Does globalization mean that we are destined to all become citizens of a homogeneous world culture? And of course, the part of the globalization, of course, has to do with cell phones, has to do with computers, has to do with worldwide communication. And the answer is probably not. And that's exactly what we're seeing with all of the trolling that's taking place. People are getting disgusted with some of the things that they encounter on the internet because people are selling their names, they're selling their information, and all of a sudden you get all kinds of strange things on the internet. Lately, my cell phone, I don't use my cell phone all that much, but when I just pull up my blank screen, I've been getting pictures of women's butts. As weird as that is, I have no idea where it came from. I don't look at any of those. Certainly wouldn't look at any of those sites on my telephone. But all of a sudden, I'll turn on my telephone and I've got a lady sticking her butt in my face. As weird as that is, I hope that's not happening to anybody else. It doesn't happen every time. It just happens like every third or fourth time. My wife gets strange things as well on her phone, and we don't know where they came from. The internet, I don't know. Ethnically diverse cities such as New York, Singapore, Toronto, and Sydney are microcosms of the world at large in many ways, and they're not homogeneous cities. They have populations that represent all of the races on Earth. New York, Singapore, Toronto, and Sydney. Each has many distinct ethnic enclaves coexisting within their boundaries. Thus, there are trends toward cultural heterogeneity globally, while there is a trend toward cultural homogeneity at the local level. But if you go to Toronto, Singapore, New York, and Sydney, you'll find you never know what you're going to see, as interesting as that is. If you're in the Quad Cities, that's where I live right now, then you know that you'll probably see a lot of individuals that are white, some people that are black, a number of Hispanic people, and that's probably pretty close to it. But if you go to Phoenix, on the other hand, you'll probably see a lot of white people. You also see a lot of indigenous people and a lot of Hispanic people and some African Americans. So, most of the cities around the world are becoming more and more heterogeneous instead of homogeneous. But Sydney, Singapore, Toronto, and New York are especially heterogeneous. We watch a lot of PBS television, and some of the television shows are coming out of Sydney now. And it's really kind of fascinating because you never know what people you're going to see. Usually if you see a Britcom, you see, white people in England, maybe a couple African Americans or Africans, not African Americans, of course. But you get something coming out of Australia, you just have no idea what people are going to look like and what they're going to be saying and doing. It's really fascinating. Cultures that are individualistic include a variety of practices and customs that encourage individuals to place their own personal goals ahead of those of the collective and to consider how they are distinct from others. Unique practices in individualistic cultures, tracking of children at school, workers being given meritocratic pay at the office, college-age children being encouraged to move out of their parents' homes, employees being given individual cubicles, people choosing to put their elderly relatives in retirement homes. Collectivistic cultures include many cultural practices, institutions, and customs that encourage individuals to place more emphasis on collective goals, the goals of one's in-group. Children sleeping with their parents. Classes of school children being promoted together to the next grade regardless of the performance of some individual children. Marriages being arranged by parents. Companies compensating their employees on the basis of how long they have been employed. Extended families living under one roof. Many surveys reveal that Americans feel more financially pressed than before, even though real incomes have been rising and time pressures have increased as two-career families have become common. Putnam in 2000 speculates that individualism has increased about 10%. Suburbanization is another reason for increased individualism in the United States, according to Putnam, and this factor is also at 10%. Suburbanization results in people spending more time in their cars and in their homes and less time with friends and neighbors. The second largest culprit to increased individualism among Americans at 25% is electronic entertainment, especially television, which leads people to isolate themselves and engage in more passive forms of entertainment. Putnam in 2000 discovered that the younger generation even watch TV differently from the way their parents and grandparents do, as they are more likely to turn the TV on even if there is nothing in particular that they have in mind to watch. The older generations are more likely to watch TV only when there is a particular show that they want to see. And I've seen this with my own children. My son, if I go visit my son, he's got the television on the whole time. He's not really paying much attention to it. Sometimes he's watching shows that he's seen before so that he doesn't have to see it. He just has to hear a little snippet of dialogue and he knows exactly what's going on. My daughter does the same thing. She leaves the television on all the time. And half the time she's not even watching. Now, the younger generations, of course, are doing exactly the same thing with Instagram, with TikTok, with YouTube. They're just watching things all the time. They're just on their screens all the time. Are they paying attention? It's hard to say whether they are or not. Approximately half of the variance behind the increasing individualism rests with the different lifestyles between younger and older generations. About 5 years ago, they started writing articles about people wanting to retire at 35. Well, here I am, I'm 75, and I haven't retired yet, and I can't even imagine retiring. But here we are. I mean, the ideas are completely different. People want more leisure time. They want all leisure time. They don't want to work at all. One of the most remarkable findings regarding cultural change is that people seem to be getting smarter. On average, across all cultures for which there is longitudinal data, people in the current generation have higher IQ scores than those from earlier generations. The trend of intelligence rising has been dubbed the Flynn effect after the researcher who first identified it. And that was Flynn. I can't remember his first name. A review of changes in IQ scores in 14 nations revealed that the average increase in IQ was between 5 and 25 points per generation. 25 points is a lot of points. If the average score is 100, now all of a sudden it's 125, which is almost a genius. According to Healy in 1990, most TV programming communicates at about a 4th grade vocabulary level, and except for Big Bang Theory, which talked about a lot of physics theories. Of men born in 1890, only 27% had more than an eighth grade education, and only 9% had any schooling after high school. In 2012, the percentage of Americans over 25 who had more than an eighth grade education was approximately 94%. 58% had some schooling after high school, and approximately 11% had graduate degrees. That's masters and PhDs. My grandfather, is that right? Yeah, my grandfather only had a third grade education. My dad only had a high school education, a little bit of college afterwards, but it was mostly he was a banker, and it had to do with working at the bank. But my grandfather, who only had a third grade education, wanted my father to quit school after the eighth grade. He didn't think there was any information that they could give him that he wouldn't need. But my grandfather was a natural genius. He invented things. So that might have had something to do with it. I didn't inherit any of his genius, by the way. Throughout the 20th century until the last couple of decades, people were able to get by with as little as an eighth grade education. And that's what my grandfather wanted my dad to do. Drop out of school. And my dad was one of 6 children, and he's the only one that graduated from high school. Of course, my dad was born in 1918. He graduated from high school in 1936. 1936. So that was during the Depression. In the 21st century, it takes some college to get by, and there is an ever-growing proportion obtaining graduate degrees. But that's in the 21st century. My mother's family, there were 3 girls and 2 boys. The 3 girls all graduated from high school, and they all went to college. But my uncles, none of them graduated from high school. They all dropped out of high school in the 8th grade on my mother's side. Societies are always looking for scapegoats to explain problems that they don't understand. In Europe, a frequent scapegoat has been alien religions, especially Judaism. And this is one of the reasons why the war in Gaza is causing so much conflict, because the Europeans, Christians, love to hate Jews. Muslims love to hate Jews. Looks like they've got everybody against them, but they seem to survive. In the 14th century, the bubonic plague and other devastating diseases like leprosy swept through Europe. Looking for someone to blame, Europeans began blaming the Jews for poisoning their wells. These beliefs led to pogroms in most of European countries, including Germany, Ukraine, and Russia. The pogroms erupted periodically into the 20th century, and this is part of a pogrom that was happening in Ukraine in the 1940s. They've stripped this lady of her clothes, and they're beating her through the street with sticks. As horrible and ugly as that is. In the 1920s, the Nazi Party gained power throughout Germany based in part on the platform of blaming all of Germany's problems on the Jewish population. Research by Voigtlander and Voth in 2012 disclosed that German cities that had Jewish pogroms in the 14th century were the same cities that had higher rates of violence against Jews in the 1920s and had higher support for the Nazi Party. So this idea of hating Jewish people seems almost to be genetic, but of course it's not. It's just something that this idea has been passed down from the 14th century. Because cultures evolve through their past circumstances, the early conditions of a culture matter a great deal with respect to how cultures subsequently evolve. The critical role of early conditions is one important reason that cultural differences can persist across time. Boston was settled by Protestant Puritans. Puritanism emphasized respect for authority and the importance of applying wealth and social position to community goals. Many of the original Puritans were highly educated intellectuals, and they felt that their dream of forming a utopia would emerge only from an educated population. Philadelphia was settled by Protestant Quakers. Quakerism emphasizes pragmatic concerns, individual equality, and tolerance. The Quakers built the University of Pennsylvania with a utilitarian curriculum, with medicine, business, and engineering schools dominating the university. The school received little community or financial support from the Quaker culture, as it had little trust in higher education. The Puritans built Harvard University using a liberal arts curriculum that emphasized community service. The university received tremendous community and financial support and is today the most heavily endowed private institution in the United States. And I looked this up, $32.9 billion. That's how much money they have endowed to them. The number of political leaders coming out of Harvard has been strong from its founding until today. Boston's culture has maintained its elitism. These people are known as the Boston Brahmins, and respect for authority that can be traced back to its Puritan roots. This idea, this hierarchy of some people are superior to others. Philadelphia's culture has remained distrustful of authority and hard to govern, yet tolerant of diversity. And of course, this is Will Smith. Did something stupid, slapped somebody in the face, and now nobody wants to let him act again, as weird as that seems. As people immigrated to Boston and Philadelphia, they tended to adjust themselves to the prevailing cultural traditions as established by the Puritans and Quakers, respectively. Hence, the cities have been able to maintain the cultural traditions of their forebears. And of course, in Boston, very controlled society. Philadelphia, they even hate their sports teams in Philadelphia. They'll yell at the Eagles, they'll yell at the Flyers, they'll yell at the Philadelphia 76ers, the Phillies. Oh man, poor guys. Often we try to figure out what others are thinking when all we have to go on is what people tell us or our observations of how they behave. Pluralistic ignorance is a tendency for people to collectively misinterpret the thoughts that underlie other people's behavior. A good example of pluralistic ignorance was divulged in the studies done looking at the German people after World War II by Hannah Arendt in 1964. Arendt determined that Nazism was not followed because the German people were evil. It was followed because they were thoughtless and conforming. And of course, we've got everybody making the Nazi salute except this guy right here. He's the only one not doing it. And that is the end of the lecture. So I'll talk to you again in the future.